The forest stood silent under the moonlit sky, its towering trees swaying gently in the night breeze. Somewhere deep within its dark heart, a presence stirred. Dormant for centuries, it was waiting, watching. Tonight, it would be awakened. "It's going to be epic," said Alex, tossing a camping bag into the trunk of his SUV. "Just us, the wilderness, and no cell service. We'll finally disconnect from the world. Epic for you. Torture for me," muttered Rachel, zipping up her hoodie. "I'm not built for the wild." "Come on, Rachel. It'll be fun," chimed in Mia, her best friend, as she adjusted her camera strap. "I'm bringing my camera. Maybe we'll capture something spooky." "Spooky? Really, Mia?" Jason smirked, leaning on the car. "We're going camping, not ghost hunting." The four friends, Alex, Rachel, Mia, and Jason, had been planning this trip for months. A weekend in Blackwood Forest, away from the city, sounded like the perfect adventure. Little did they know the forest had its own plans. The group drove for hours, leaving the bustling city behind. As they got closer to Blackwood Forest, the roads narrowed, and the towering trees grew thicker, blocking out the sunlight. "Are we there yet?" Rachel groaned. "Almost," Alex replied, checking the GPS. "We're about 30 minutes away." Mia rolled down the window, letting the cool forest air fill the car. "It's beautiful out here. So peaceful." "Yeah, too peaceful," Jason said, half-jokingly. "It's like something's watching us." Rachel slapped his arm. "Don't start with the creepy stuff. We're here to relax." They finally reached the edge of the forest, where they parked the car and unloaded their gear. The path to their campsite was a narrow trail leading deep into the woods. "This place is huge," Mia said, snapping photos. "And creepy," Rachel added, glancing around nervously. The trees loomed over them like silent guardians, their branches twisting like skeletal fingers. "Relax," Alex said, leading the way. "This forest is famous for its untouched beauty. No one comes here anymore, which makes it perfect for us." As they walked, the group noticed how quiet the forest was. No birds, no rustling leaves, just the sound of their footsteps. "Doesn't it feel too quiet?" Jason asked, breaking the silence. "It's just your imagination," Alex said, though even he felt a chill run down his spine. By late afternoon, they reached a clearing surrounded by dense trees. The group quickly set up their tents and built a small fire. As the sun began to set, the forest took on an eerie quality. Shadows stretched across the ground, and the once inviting trees now seemed menacing. "This is going to be awesome," Alex said, poking the fire with a stick. "Sure, if we don't get eaten by bears," Rachel muttered, pulling her sleeping bag out of her backpack. "No bears here," Alex assured her. "Just us and nature, and maybe ghosts," Mia teased, pointing her camera at Rachel, who rolled her eyes. As darkness fell, the group gathered around the fire, roasting marshmallows and sharing stories. "Let's tell scary stories," Mia suggested, her eyes gleaming. "Oh great," Rachel groaned. "As if this place isn't creepy enough." Jason leaned forward, his face illuminated by the firelight. "I've got one. They say Blackwood Forest is haunted. Decades ago, a whole village disappeared overnight. No one knows what happened to them. Some say their spirits still wander the woods, looking for anyone who dares enter their territory." "Not funny," Rachel said, clutching her blanket. "It's just a story," Alex said, though he couldn't shake the feeling of unease growing in his chest. The group was about to call it a night when they heard it. A low, guttural sound coming from the trees. "What was that?" Rachel whispered, her eyes wide. "Probably an animal," Alex said, trying to sound confident. "That didn't sound like any animal I've ever heard," Jason said, grabbing a flashlight. The sound came again, louder this time. It was a deep, growling noise, followed by the rustling of leaves. "Maybe we should check it out," Mia suggested, standing up with her camera. "Or maybe we should stay right here," Rachel said, her voice trembling. Alex and Jason exchanged glances. "We'll just take a quick look," Alex said. Alex and Jason ventured into the trees with flashlights, leaving the girls by the fire. The forest was pitch black, their beams of light barely penetrating the darkness. "Do you see anything?" Jason asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Nothing," Alex replied. "It's probably just an animal. Let's head back." As they turned to leave, a chilling sound froze them in their tracks. A whisper, faint but unmistakable. "Did you hear that?" Jason asked, his voice shaking. Before Alex could reply, something darted past them, too fast to see. "What the hell was that?" Alex shouted, his flashlight trembling in his hand. Back at the campsite, Mia and Rachel were huddled together by the fire when the boys burst out of the trees, their faces pale. "What happened?" Mia asked. "We're not alone," Alex said, his voice shaking. Before anyone could respond, the fire flickered and went out, plunging the group into darkness. The forest seemed to come alive around them. Rustling leaves, snapping branches, and that same guttural growl, now impossibly close. Then they saw it. A pair of glowing eyes appeared in the darkness, staring at them with an intensity that froze them in place. The figure was tall and shadowy, its form shifting like smoke. And then it spoke. "You should not have come here." Alex, Mia, Jason, and Rachel stood frozen by the fire, their hearts pounding in their chests. The figure they had seen in the darkness was no longer just a shadow. It was something alive. The glowing eyes in the blackness were piercing and seemed to follow every movement they made. The air grew cold, and an oppressive silence settled over the group. Rachel was the first to break the stillness, her voice barely a whisper. "What is that? What is it?" No one answered. They couldn't. The figure had spoken, but the words hung in the air, heavy and chilling. "You should not have come here." The voice echoed through the trees, deep and guttural, as though it came from the very earth beneath them. It sent a wave of dread through their bones. I don't like this," Rachel said, backing away slowly. "I want to leave. Now." Alex glanced nervously around the campsite. The fire had gone out completely, leaving only the faintest trace of smoke curling up into the night air. The darkness felt thicker now, as if the forest itself was closing in on them. "Stay calm," Alex whispered, though his voice trembled. He knew they needed to stick together, but the fear gnawing at him was too real. Jason turned his flashlight toward the trees, his hand shaking. "We need to get out of here. Now." But before they could move, the figure spoke again. "Leaving won't save you." The voice was louder this time, more forceful. It wasn't just speaking to them. It was speaking through them into their very souls. Mia's camera slipped from her hands, crashing to the ground. I don't think we should stay," she whispered, eyes wide with terror. "I think we've woken something up." The group turned to flee, but as they did, the shadows around them seemed to shift. The trees stretched higher, their branches reaching like twisted fingers, blocking the path. No matter which way they looked, the darkness seemed to grow deeper, more suffocating. "Where's the way out?" Alex said, his voice cracking. "We need to go back to the car." But when they tried to move, the air seemed to resist them. It felt thick, heavy, like they were wading through water. The ground beneath them was uneven, and every step seemed to take more effort. Suddenly, Mia screamed, It's in the trees." Everyone looked up, and their hearts sank. Above them, in the darkest part of the forest, They saw it. A figure barely visible against the night sky. It was tall, impossibly tall, with limbs that stretched unnaturally long. Its head was tilted at an odd angle, and its glowing eyes pierced through the darkness, locking onto them. The figure was watching them. "No, no, no," Jason whispered, backing away. His legs were shaky, and he stumbled on a rock, barely catching himself. "We have to get to the car," Alex shouted, grabbing Mia's arm. But the figure didn't move. It just stood there, its gaze never leaving them. The air felt colder still. Their breaths came out in sharp, visible puffs. The forest was silent once again, the growling noise from earlier replaced by a quiet, unnatural stillness. Mia's voice quivered as she spoke. We can't outrun it. We need to hide. We have to hide." But where could they hide? The trees around them were too thin, the ground too exposed, and that thing, whatever it was already everywhere. Alex shook his head. "We're not staying here. We need to move now, while it's still far enough away." The group moved quickly, stumbling through the forest, but it felt like the woods themselves were turning against them. Every direction they turned led them deeper into the trees, and the figure, still standing in the same spot, was always watching. Rachel was ahead, her breath quick and shallow. She looked over her shoulder, panic in her eyes. "It's following us. I swear to God it's following us." Alex didn't want to look back. He could feel the weight of the creature's gaze pressing into his back. He pushed forward, his legs burning with exhaustion, but every step felt like it took them nowhere. "We're getting nowhere," Jason said, his voice desperate. "We're trapped." "No, we're not," Alex snapped, trying to keep the fear from his voice. "We just need to keep moving. There's a clearing ahead. We'll make it there, I promise." But as they reached the edge of the trees, they saw something that made their blood run cold. A wide, empty space. There was no exit, no path leading out of the forest. Just endless blackness. "No, no, no, no," Rachel screamed, her hands trembling as she backed into a tree. "We're stuck." And then it happened. The figure moved. At first, it was barely noticeable. A shadow slipping between the trees, a dark shape melding with the night. Then, it stepped out into the clearing, slowly, deliberately. It was tall, too tall, and it seemed to stretch, its form shifting in unnatural ways. Alex, Mia, Rachel, and Jason all froze. The figure took another step. The ground shook under their feet. And then the voice again. "You should have never come here. Now you belong to me." In an instant, the forest erupted. The ground trembled as the entity moved closer, faster than they had ever imagined. The friends turned and ran. No plan, no direction, just the desperate need to escape. But no matter how fast they ran, the trees around them closed in tighter. The air became thick and heavy, pulling at their limbs, making it harder to breathe, harder to think. And then, the lights in the forest flickered. Faint, distant lights, like fireflies, appeared in the corners of their vision. For a moment, they seemed like a promise of safety. But as they drew closer, the lights dimmed, and the shadows grew longer, until the lights themselves seemed to flicker and fade away. "Keep running," Alex screamed, pushing Mia ahead of him. But when he looked back, the figure was gone. For a moment, he thought they had escaped. But then the voice came again, closer this time. "You cannot escape." The forest was unnervingly quiet. After their frantic flight, the friends slowed down, exhausted and terrified. Their breaths came in sharp, panicked gasps, but all they could hear was the sound of their own footsteps on the dry leaves. "Where is it?" Mia whispered, her voice trembling. She glanced behind her, searching the darkness for any sign of the thing that had been chasing them. Alex, struggling to control his own fear, scanned the trees. I don't know. It was right behind us. His words trailed off as a strange chill crawled up his spine. It was like the very air had shifted. The darkness felt heavier now, pressing against him, waiting. Suddenly, a loud crack echoed through the silence. Everyone froze. "Did you hear that?" Jason whispered. Mia nodded, her eyes wide. "It sounded like someone stepped on a branch." Alex nodded, but something deep in his gut told him it wasn't just the wind. The forest was alive with something else, something far darker. Without another word, they began moving again. Their steps were cautious, each one more hesitant than the last. The trees seemed to loom over them, twisting in strange shapes as if they were reaching out, trying to block their path. "We need to find a way out," Rachel muttered, her voice barely audible. "This place, it feels wrong." Her words hung in the air, and for a moment, no one spoke. The truth of it was undeniable. Everything about the forest felt unnatural, empty, yet full of something unseen. Alex looked around desperately. There has to be a way out. We've been walking in circles. The car. It's just a little further, right? Mia shook her head, her face pale. I don't think we're close to anything. I don't even remember where we came from anymore. Jason turned sharply, his eyes darting around. "No, we've been going in circles. This place is messing with our heads. We've been here too long. They were trapped." And the thought sent a shiver of panic through Alex's chest. There was no way out. As they walked, the feeling of being watched grew stronger. Alex couldn't shake the sensation that the trees were closing in on them, leaning closer with every step. He looked over his shoulder again, but saw nothing. Just the empty, shadow-filled forest behind them. But still, he felt it. The thing that had been chasing them, the entity, was still here. It was watching them, waiting. Rachel suddenly stopped. "Do you hear that?" At first, no one said anything, but then the faintest whisper drifted through the trees. It was a soft sound, like the wind brushing against leaves, but it was more than that. Felt like voices, far away but clear. Mia took a step back. "Is it talking to us?" Jason looked nervous, his eyes wide with fear. "It's not the wind. It's not normal." Alex clenched his fists, trying to control the rising panic inside him. "It's trying to scare us. We can't let it." Keep moving, but no matter how fast they walked, the feeling of the forest closing in on them didn't fade. The whispers seemed to grow louder, more distinct, like they were being spoken directly into their ears. Rachel was almost in tears. I can't take it anymore. I want to go home. Please, let's go home." But there was no home, no way out. Just the endless, dark forest and the eyes that were always watching them. They walked for what felt like hours, but there was no end in sight. It was as though the forest stretched on forever, each turn only leading them deeper into the abyss. And then, out of nowhere, the atmosphere shifted again. The temperature dropped sharply. A cold wind whispered through the trees, carrying with it an unmistakable stench, like decay, old and rotting. Alex stopped in his tracks. "What is that smell?" Jason turned his head. It's coming from over there." He pointed toward a dense thicket of trees. Through the branches, something caught his eye. "Look," Jason muttered, his voice shaking. A shadow moved. It was fast, too fast for something that size. In the brief moment it passed through the trees, Alex caught a glimpse of it. The figure. It wasn't just a shadow this time. It was a shape twisted and wrong. A tall, emaciated figure with long, thin arms that hung at unnatural angles. Its face was nothing but a twisted mask of darkness, with two glowing eyes that pierced the blackness. Mia gasped, clutching her chest. "It's real," she whispered, almost in disbelief. "We need to run," Rachel whispered. looking desperately at the others. But Alex couldn't move. His legs were frozen in place. His heart was pounding in his chest, but his body wouldn't respond. The entity was here, standing right in front of them, hidden behind the trees, its eyes watching them. Then, a voice echoed from within the forest, deep, powerful, and almost mocking. "You cannot run." The ground beneath their feet trembled, and Alex could feel it in his bones. The figure was no longer just watching them. It was moving, closing in, and there was no escape. "Run!" Alex screamed, breaking the spell that had held them all still. They didn't need any more encouragement. Without looking back, they turned and bolted, crashing through the underbrush, the sound of their footsteps echoing in the night. But the forest was shifting around them. The trees were no longer just trees. They were walls closing in, trapping them in the darkness. No matter how fast they ran, no matter how hard they pushed themselves, they couldn't escape. The forest had become a maze, impossible to navigate, impossible to leave. Behind them, the entity was coming closer. Its footsteps were heavy, like the sound of something dragging across the earth. Every step it took seemed to make the ground shake. Rachel screamed, her voice shrill. "It's going to get us. It's going to..." She didn't finish. There was a loud crash, and Rachel stumbled, falling to the ground. Mia screamed as she rushed to help her. But the entity was almost upon them. "We have to get out of here," Alex gasped, pulling Rachel to her feet. But it was too late. The shadow was upon them, faster than they could imagine. The air grew cold, and the ground beneath them seemed to crumble. The entity's voice echoed one final time. "You belong to me now." Rachel's scream still echoed in Alex's ears. He had pulled her up, but the fear and desperation in her eyes told him it was too late. They were running for their lives, but no matter how fast they ran, the forest seemed to stretch on forever. The dark trees loomed like silent giants, their twisted branches reaching down like claws, trying to trap them. The cold wind bit through their skin, and the stench of decay filled the air again, stronger than ever. The figure, the thing in the woods, was behind them. They could feel it even though they couldn't see it. It was as if the forest itself was alive. Alive with something evil, something ancient, something that had been waiting for them. "We can't outrun it," Jason panted, his voice full of panic. "We have to try," Alex shouted, his legs burning as they pushed forward. But it was no use. The forest was not a place to escape from. The trees seemed to move, shifting as they ran, blocking their path, forcing them deeper into the woods. Every time Alex thought he saw a way out, it was gone in an instant. The creature's presence grew stronger, the air heavier with each passing second. It was coming closer. "Do you hear that?" Mia whispered, her voice trembling. Everyone stopped. For a moment, the sound of their panicked breathing was all they could hear. And then it came again, that whisper. It was soft at first, like a rustle in the leaves. But then it grew louder, a voice, low and guttural, as if it was speaking from the ground itself. "You are mine." Alex turned sharply, his heart racing. The voice was close, too close, but he saw nothing. "We need to keep moving," he said, his voice hoarse. "Don't stop." They kept running, but the voice followed them, always just behind. It was mocking, taunting. It wasn't long before the forest seemed to swallow them whole. Alex could feel the ground beneath him shifting, the trees closing in tighter, and the air growing heavier. He wanted to scream, but he couldn't. The words wouldn't come out. All he could do was run. Rachel was beside him, but she wasn't the same. Her eyes were wide with terror, her steps faltering. She kept glancing over her shoulder, as though expecting something to reach out and grab her. "Rachel, focus," Alex shouted, but it was too late. Rachel let out a strangled cry, her eyes wide in terror as she stumbled to the ground. Alex's heart stopped. "No," he yelled, running back toward her. Jason and Mia followed, but they were too late. Rachel was already on the ground, her body twisted unnaturally, her arms and legs bent at impossible angles. The darkness around them thickened. The trees seemed to lean in, their branches creaking and groaning as though they were alive. The air was suffocating. Alex knelt beside her, but there was no sign of life in her eyes. Her chest didn't rise and fall. She was gone. And then they heard it, the sound of footsteps, slow, heavy, coming closer. It was the creature. "Run!" Jason shouted, grabbing Alex's arm. They didn't need to be told twice. Mia, still in shock, stumbled after them as they sprinted through the woods. Alex's heart was pounding in his chest, his mind racing. But no matter how fast they ran, the presence of the entity was always just behind them. It was like the very forest was a prison. They reached a clearing, and for a moment there was hope. The trees opened up, and Alex could see the moonlight above, a faint promise of freedom. But the moment they stepped into the clearing, the earth seemed to tremble beneath them. Mia screamed as the ground cracked open, a deep, rumbling sound echoing through the forest. Alex looked around, panic rising in his chest. "We have to go." But it was too late. The entity had found them. From the shadows of the trees, the figure emerged. Taller now, more defined, its glowing eyes piercing the darkness. It was no longer hiding. "Run!" Alex screamed, but he didn't need to. They were already running. But this time they couldn't escape. The entity was faster now. The air was thick with fear, suffocating them as they ran. The trees seemed to shift around them, trapping them in an endless maze. And then it came. The thing reached out with its long, bony fingers, grabbing Mia by the arm. "Mia!" Jason screamed, but it was too late. The entity's grip tightened, pulling her toward it. Her scream echoed through the trees, but it was cut off abruptly. Alex and Jason were frozen in place, their bodies shaking with terror. They couldn't move. They couldn't help her. The entity dragged her into the shadows, her body disappearing into the darkness. And then there was silence. Alex and Jason were left standing in the clearing, the weight of the silence pressing down on them. They didn't speak. They didn't move. They just stood there, terrified, knowing the worst had happened. The forest had claimed them. But even in the silence, the presence of the entity was still there, watching them. It wasn't finished. "You cannot escape," the voice echoed, soft and cruel. Alex could feel it now, closing in on him, the darkness wrapping around him like a shroud. He turned to Jason, his eyes wide with fear. "We need to go. Now!" But Jason was staring at something behind Alex, his face pale with terror. "Jason!" Alex whispered, his voice shaky. "Behind you," Jason gasped. Alex turned slowly, and his blood ran cold. The figure was there, standing just behind him. It had grown even taller, more terrifying. Its face was a twisted mass of shadow, its glowing eyes piercing into his soul. "No, no, no, and no!" Alex screamed, but the words died in his throat. The entity reached out with long, bony fingers. The air around Alex grew colder, suffocating. He couldn't breathe. And then, everything went black. Alex's chest heaved, his breath shallow as he opened his eyes. He could barely make out shapes in the darkness, his vision clouded and blurry. A cold chill ran through him, sending a wave of dread across his entire body. His heart pounded in his chest as memories flooded back. Rachel, Mia, Jason, they were gone. The terror, the creature, everything was still fresh, still so real. He tried to move, but his body felt heavy, like it was being dragged down by some unseen force. His hands were trembling, his arms numb. He struggled to sit up, but everything felt wrong. Where was he? What happened? He glanced around in the dark, his heart pounding faster. The forest seemed to stretch on endlessly, the trees towering over him like dark giants. The faintest light of the moon barely reached the ground, casting eerie shadows that seemed to shift and twist as he looked at them. Was he dreaming? A sudden rustling sound broke the silence. It was close, too close. Alex froze, every muscle in his body tensing. He didn't dare to look back, afraid of what he might see. For a moment, there was only the sound of his own heartbeat, thumping louder in his ears. But then, a low whisper, barely audible, slithered through the trees. "Come to me." Alex's blood ran cold. No, he tried to scream, but his voice wouldn't come. He felt paralyzed. His mind raced. Was it the creature? Was it coming for him next? With a surge of adrenaline, he pushed himself to his feet, his legs weak beneath him. He had to get out. He had to survive. But the forest, the trees, they seemed to close in on him. The branches reached out like skeletal hands, scratching at his skin as he moved. The darkness pressed in from all sides, suffocating him. He was lost. The woods were alive, and the entity was still hunting him. Just as Alex was about to collapse from exhaustion, a voice cut through the silence, startling him. "Hey, Alex!" He spun around, his heart leaping in his chest. Was it Jason? Mia? Was someone else here? But when he looked, he saw nothing. Only the endless rows of trees, their twisted forms casting long shadows in the moonlight. "Hey, Alex!" The voice came again, weaker this time. It was Rachel's voice. "No, it can't be. She's gone." But the voice called to him again, like a whisper from the past. "I'm still here. Help me, Alex." A shiver ran down his spine. He stumbled forward, the voice leading him deeper into the woods. He knew it was wrong. He knew it wasn't Rachel. Couldn't be. But something inside him pulled him forward, an irresistible need to follow. The fear gnawed at him, but the voice was stronger. Promised answers. Promised an end to the terror. He didn't know how long he had been walking, the trees seeming to shift and twist around him. The path ahead was unclear, the forest an endless maze. He was alone, yet he couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching him, stalking him. Then the voice stopped. For a moment, there was nothing but the rustling of leaves in the wind. Alex stood still, unsure of what to do. His heart pounded in his chest, each beat echoing in the silence. What was that? A sudden rustle from behind made him spin around. His breath caught in his throat. There, standing just beyond the reach of the moonlight, was the figure. The creature, its glowing eyes pierced through the darkness, watching him with an unnatural hunger. Its long, shadowy form was outlined against the trees, but it was impossible to make out its face. It was a silhouette of terror, a presence that filled him with dread. No, not now. Alex's legs shook beneath him, but he couldn't move. He could feel the creature's gaze upon him, could feel its hunger growing. He wanted to run. He had to run, but his body wouldn't obey. And then it spoke. The voice was cold, cruel, and filled with malice. "You're mine." It was too much. The darkness, the fear, the feeling of being trapped. It all hit him at once. His mind raced, his body screamed for release, but nothing happened. Suddenly, the creature stepped forward, its movement unnaturally fluid, like it was gliding across the ground. The air grew colder with every step it took, as if the temperature itself was bowing to the presence of the entity. Alex took a step back, but it was no use. The creature was closing in, its long, bony arms stretching toward him, its eyes burning with an otherworldly light. "You belong to me," it hissed. And then, as if from nowhere, a loud crash echoed through the forest. A nearby tree fell with a sickening groan, and the creature stopped in its tracks. Alex didn't hesitate. He bolted, pushing himself to run faster than he ever had before. He could feel the creature behind him, its presence so close that he could almost hear its breathing. The trees seemed to close in, their branches reaching out to stop him. But he didn't care. He had to escape. He had to survive. But the forest was playing its own game. The trees twisted and bent, creating a labyrinth, leading him deeper and deeper into the heart of the darkness. The air was thick with fear, the ground uneven and treacherous. And then he heard it again, the whisper, "Come to me." He stopped, his heart racing, his breath ragged. The voice, it was everywhere now, inside his head, in his ears, in the trees, in the very air he breathed. But as he took another step, something caught his eye, a flash of light. It was faint, barely noticeable, but it was there. It was a break in the trees, a gap in the darkness. Hope. Alex pushed forward, faster now, following the light. The trees seemed to give way as he ran, and soon, he broke free of the dense woods. He found himself standing at the edge of a clearing. In the center of the clearing was a small, abandoned cabin. The light he had seen before was coming from the cabin's window. For the first time since he had entered the forest, Alex felt a sense of relief. He had to get inside. He ran toward the cabin, his legs heavy, but the fear of the creature pushing him forward. He reached the door and yanked it open. The cabin was empty, cold, and musty, but it was shelter. Alex slammed the door shut behind him, locking it. He leaned against the wall, gasping for breath. But he wasn't alone. The air in the cabin was thick with tension, heavy with an unseen presence. He could feel it watching him. "It's here." A shadow moved across the room, and Alex's heart stopped. He turned toward the corner, his breath hitching in his throat. And there, standing in the darkness, was the creature. Its glowing eyes burned into him, and its long fingers twitched, ready to strike. The darkness was closing in, and Alex had no escape. Alex's breath came in ragged gasps as his eyes locked onto the dark figure in the corner of the cabin. The creature stood motionless, its eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. He could feel the air grow heavier, thicker with every passing second, as if the walls themselves were closing in on him. He could hear his heart pounding in his ears, the silence broken only by the soft creak of the cabin's old timbers. He tried to move, to make a run for the door, but his legs felt frozen, weighed down by the crushing dread that surrounded him. The creature's gaze never wavered, its cold, lifeless stare seeming to pierce through him, right into his soul. Alex could feel the hairs on the back of his neck stand up, a wave of nausea washing over him. "I can't die here. I won't." With a burst of energy, he pushed off the wall and sprinted toward the door. But just as he reached for the handle, the door slammed shut, as if an invisible force had locked it in place. He tried again, pulling at the handle with all his strength, but it was no use. The door wouldn't budge. He turned around, panic rising in his chest. The creature hadn't moved. It was still standing in the corner, but now it seemed different. It was closer, much closer. Alex stumbled back, his eyes darting around the cabin. His mind raced. What was he going to do? There had to be something, anything that could help him escape. Then he noticed something. A small, dusty book lying on a rickety table in the center of the room. It wasn't much, but it was the only thing in the cabin that seemed out of place. The creature's eyes never left him, but the book seemed to glow faintly, almost as if it were calling to him. Against his better judgment, Alex moved toward the table, his steps hesitant. He could feel the creature watching him, waiting for him to make a move. He could hear its breathing now, slow and deliberate, like a predator sizing up its prey. With trembling hands, he reached for the book. The moment his fingers brushed against it, a strange, cold energy shot up his arm, making his skin tingle. He recoiled for a moment, but then, with a deep breath, he opened the book. The pages were old and yellowed with age. The writing was faint, barely legible, but as he scanned the pages, a chill ran down his spine. The book was filled with strange symbols and cryptic words, and as he flipped through, one phrase seemed to stand out. The entity waits. It hunts. It has always hunted. Alex felt his pulse quicken as he read the words. What did they mean? Was this some kind of ritual? A warning? He turned the page, his hands shaking, and found a picture. It was a drawing of a figure that looked eerily like the creature in the corner of the room. But the thing that stood out the most was the face, or rather, the lack of one. The figure was faceless, a black void where its eyes should have been. A lump formed in Alex's throat. Was this what he was dealing with? Some ancient being, trapped in this forest for centuries? The book offered no answers, only more questions. But then, something else caught his eye. At the bottom of the page, in faint, barely legible writing, were two words. The seal. The seal? What did that mean? Before he could think any further, a low growl echoed through the cabin. The air grew colder, and Alex could feel the creature moving again. It was no longer standing still. It was coming toward him. Panic surged through him. He slammed the book shut, holding it tightly in his hands. The creature's footsteps grew louder, its shadow stretching across the floor like a growing nightmare. Alex had no time to think. He had to act. He turned and ran to the back of the cabin, desperately searching for a way out. There had to be a window, a hidden door, something. But all he found was a wall, solid and unyielding. The growl grew louder, closer. Alex could feel the heat of the creature's presence, even without seeing it. It was behind him, getting nearer with every passing second. I'm not going to make it. His hands were shaking, sweat dripping down his face as he spun around to face the creature. It was standing in the doorway, its glowing eyes fixed on him, its dark form nearly filling the entire frame of the door. The air was thick with malice, a palpable force that seemed to choke him. Suddenly, the cabin seemed to come alive. The floorboards creaked and groaned. The walls shifted as if the cabin itself was moving. Alex's heart raced. What was happening? The creature let out a deafening screech, its form twisting and contorting in ways that defied logic. It was no longer just a figure. It was something far worse, something that seemed to exist in every shadow, every crevice of the cabin. Alex stumbled back, his legs giving way beneath him. He fell to the ground, the book still clutched tightly in his hands. He didn't know what to do, what was real anymore. The creature was everywhere. It was in the walls, in the floor, in the very air he breathed. Then something inside him snapped. He had to fight. He had to survive. The creature couldn't take him, couldn't win. With a burst of strength, Alex jumped to his feet and rushed toward the creature, brandishing the book in front of him like a weapon. The creature paused, its glowing eyes narrowing. It let out a low, guttural growl, but Alex didn't stop. He had to break the cycle. He raised the book high and slammed it down onto the ground. And then everything stopped. For a moment, there was nothing. No growls, no footsteps, no breathing. The cabin was silent. The air was still. Alex froze, waiting for the next move, the next attack. But nothing happened. Alex's heart pounded in his chest as he slowly lowered the book. His breathing was ragged, his body covered in sweat. Had he done it? Had he somehow stopped the creature? But then, the air around him grew thick again, like a storm was brewing. A shadow began to rise from the floor, swirling and twisting like smoke. Alex's eyes widened in horror as the shadow began to take shape. It was the creature. Only now it was bigger, darker, more powerful than before. Its eyes burned with a terrifying intensity as it lunged forward, its mouth opening wide to reveal rows of jagged, sharp teeth. Alex had no time to react. He tried to scream, but no sound came out. The creature was upon him in an instant, its cold claws digging into his flesh as it dragged him toward the darkness. But just as he felt himself being consumed by the void, a blinding light flashed through the cabin, filling every corner with pure, white light. The creature screeched, its form writhing in pain as the light burned it away. Alex felt himself being pulled toward the light, away from the creature, away from the horror that had haunted him for so long. But as the light grew brighter, he realized something. The creature wasn't gone. It wasn't over. It had only retreated, and it would be back. The blinding light slowly began to fade, leaving behind only an eerie silence. Alex stood frozen, his breath shallow and erratic, his body trembling. He blinked rapidly, trying to make sense of what had just happened. The creature, the terrifying entity that had haunted him for days, had retreated, faded into the light. But why? Was it truly gone? Or was it just waiting for another moment to strike? His heart pounded in his chest, every beat echoing in the quiet forest. The only sounds were the soft rustling of the trees outside and the distant howling wind. But the peace felt wrong, as if the world had been paused, holding its breath. Alex's eyes darted around the cabin, searching for any sign of the creature. The walls were still, the floorboards undisturbed. But deep down, Alex knew that the calm was only temporary. He could feel it in his bones. The creature wasn't finished. It had just begun. He took a hesitant step forward, his hand still gripping the book tightly. The book that had somehow triggered the light, had it really worked? He didn't know. But as his fingers traced over its pages, something inside him stirred. The book was warm, almost as if it had a life of its own, as if it had just awakened from a long slumber. Alex shook his head. This couldn't be happening. He was in the middle of the woods, trapped in a cabin with a deadly creature hunting him, and yet he felt calm. It didn't make sense. The fear that had gripped him moments before was still there, lingering just beneath the surface. But now there was something else, something darker. It's not over. It won't be. The thought sent a chill down his spine. But just as he was about to move, the ground beneath him trembled. It was faint at first, a small vibration that seemed to come from deep within the earth. But then it grew, slowly at first, then faster, stronger, until the whole cabin began to shake. Alex stumbled, his hands reaching for the nearest table to steady himself. The book fell from his grip, clattering to the floor, its pages flipping wildly as if caught in an invisible wind. The walls groaned and cracked, and the air grew heavy, thick with the presence of something terrible. Then, in the midst of the shaking, a sound broke through. It was soft at first, just a whisper, a low, guttural noise, almost like a growl. But as the seconds passed, the growl grew louder, more distinct, more terrifying. Alex's heart leapt into his throat as the creature's form materialized once more. This time, it wasn't just a shadow. It was something solid, something real, and it was far more monstrous than before. Its eyes glowed brighter, burning with an unnatural fire, and its body seemed to shift in and out of the shadows, like it was made of pure darkness. It stood in the doorway, its form filling the frame, blocking any escape. Its breathing was ragged, deep and slow, like the sound of the forest at night. Alex's legs refused to move. His mind screamed at him to run, to escape, but his body betrayed him. He was paralyzed, trapped in the presence of this ancient terror. The creature let out a low growl, and then it spoke. Its voice was like 1,000 whispers, each one filled with malice and hunger. "You cannot escape." The words sent a jolt of terror through Alex's chest. It was true. He couldn't escape. The creature was everywhere. It was in the cabin, in the forest, in the very air he breathed. And it wasn't just hunting him. It was toying with him. The words were written in a language Alex didn't recognize, but he could feel the meaning behind them, like a deep instinct. The seal was a binding ritual. It wasn't just a spell, it was a trap, a way to imprison the entity once and for all. But the ritual wasn't simple. It required blood. It required sacrifice. Alex's blood. He hesitated. Sacrifice? What did that mean? Was he willing to pay such a price? The creature's growl deepened, and its presence grew stronger. Alex's mind raced. If he didn't act now, he would die. His friends would die. The creature would continue to hunt forever. He looked down at his hands, trembling with fear. He was terrified, but something inside him had changed. He had to stop this thing, no matter the cost. The creature stepped forward, its movements slow and deliberate. The floor creaked beneath its weight, and Alex could feel the room growing colder, the air growing heavier with every passing second. But then, something inside Alex clicked. He remembered the words in the book, the cryptic message that spoke of a seal. The seal. Could this be the key to stopping it? Could the book hold the answer he desperately needed? Without thinking, Alex dropped to his knees and reached for the book. His hands were shaking, but he forced himself to focus. He flipped through the pages, desperate to find anything that might help him. The creature's growl grew louder, more insistent, but Alex didn't stop. He had to find it. He had to find the seal. His fingers finally stopped on a page that seemed different. The symbols were clearer, more distinct. He could feel the power radiating from the page. This was it, the seal. With a trembling hand, Alex pressed his fingers to the page, his blood staining the words. The air crackled with energy, and the room seemed to warp around him. The walls began to pulse, the shadows growing darker, more alive. The creature hissed in rage, its glowing eyes narrowing as it realized what Alex was doing. It let out a deafening roar, charging toward him with the speed of a nightmare. But Alex didn't stop. He finished the ritual, his blood dripping onto the page as the words burned into his skin. The cabin seemed to collapse in on itself, the floor shaking violently as the seal took hold. And then, just as the creature was upon him, the entire cabin exploded in a blinding flash of light. The world exploded into a blinding flash. For a moment, Alex couldn't see, couldn't think. Everything around him vanished into a haze of white light, a stark contrast to the suffocating darkness that had filled the cabin only moments ago. He felt his body jerk forward, his feet lifting from the floor, as if something powerful was pulling him into the light. His heart raced, and every fiber of his being screamed to wake up, to escape, to run. But there was nowhere to go. Time seemed to stand still. The light burned bright, almost blinding him. But through the haze, Alex heard a sound. A scream louder and louder, echoing in his ears. It was a horrible, guttural sound, filled with pain and anger. The creature's roar, but it was fading. Slowly, the light began to dim. The walls of the cabin, once cracked and trembling, were now still. The air was clear, fresh, no longer heavy with the creature's presence. The growls, the whispers, the terrifying force that had haunted them, it was all gone. Alex blinked, his vision clearing as the light softened. He was still on the floor, his hand gripping the open book, its pages stained with his blood. He looked around, and for the first time in what felt like forever, the cabin seemed normal. The dark shadows that once lurked in every corner were gone. The air felt calm, still, almost serene. Had it worked? He couldn't believe it. After everything, after the terror, the darkness, the horrifying presence of the creature, was it truly over? Alex cautiously stood up, his legs shaky from the fear and exhaustion. His body ached, and his head felt heavy, as if it had been trapped in a nightmare for days. He took a deep breath, trying to steady his thoughts, trying to make sense of what had just happened. But the questions were still there. Was it really gone? Was the creature truly defeated? Or had it just gone into hiding, waiting for another moment to strike? Alex took a step toward the door, his hand still holding the book. The room was quiet now, too quiet. He could hear the sound of his own breath, but nothing else. No movement, no whispers, no growls. He tried to listen closely, but there was nothing, no sign that the creature was still there. But even as he opened the door, a small part of him couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The air outside was cold, the wind biting at his skin as it swept through the forest. The trees swayed, their branches creaking under the pressure. But there was something different, something off. Alex stepped out of the cabin, his eyes scanning the trees, the dark shadows now looming far in the distance. The woods seemed endless. The trees towered over him like silent sentinels, their gnarled branches twisting into the sky. It was almost as if the forest was alive, watching him. And then, in the distance, he heard it. A sound, a whisper, a faint rustling, like footsteps in the leaves. It was far away, but it was unmistakable. Alex's blood ran cold. His heart began to race again. The creature, it wasn't over. His mind raced as the truth began to settle in. He had thought the ritual had worked. He had thought the creature was gone, banished into the light. But now, standing in the forest, surrounded by the trees, he understood. The creature wasn't just a physical force. It was something older, something more ancient. A presence that couldn't be destroyed so easily. Alex's hand clenched around the book. The pages fluttered as if they were alive, moving against the wind. He felt a strange connection to it, something deep and primal. The book had been the key, but it was only a part of the puzzle. The forest, the entity, it had always been there. It had always been a part of the land. And now Alex was part of it too. He turned around and saw the cabin standing behind him, its windows dark, its door wide open. It looked so ordinary, so calm. But Alex knew better now. The entity wasn't something that could simply be erased. It was in the land, in the forest, and in the very earth beneath his feet. And now it had him. The wind grew stronger, swirling around him, and Alex's heart pounded in his chest. He had been a fool to think it would be that easy. He had been so desperate for answers, so eager to escape, that he hadn't considered the true cost. The forest whispered again, louder this time. It wasn't just the wind. It was a voice that Alex knew all too well. A low, guttural whisper that echoed in his mind. "You cannot leave." Alex froze, his breath catching in his throat. The entity wasn't gone. It wasn't retreating. It was claiming him. Suddenly, he felt the weight of the book in his hands, heavier now than before. The pages were warm again, and the words seemed to glow in the dim light. The ritual had worked, but at a cost. The entity was bound to him now. It had followed him from the forest, and now it was part of him. A flash of memories hit him, memories of the creature's growls, its monstrous form, its rage. The entity had always been there, hiding in the forest, waiting for someone like him to come along. And now that it had found him, it would never let go. Alex's mind raced as he realized the truth. He had been chosen not as a victim, but as a vessel. The entity had marked him, and now it was part of him, bound to him through the blood he had spilled. There was no escape, but there was a way to stop it, a way to seal it, to keep it locked inside forever. But that meant a final sacrifice, a choice that Alex had to make. He could destroy the book. He could burn it, and with it, the entity would be banished for good. But that would cost him everything. He would never escape the forest, and his body would be consumed by the darkness. Or he could accept the entity, accept the power it offered, and live with it forever. Alex stood at the edge of the forest, his heart torn between the two choices. The wind howled around him, the whispers growing louder. The creature was waiting. The choice was his, but there was no easy way out.